Part 1. The Unconscious. Carl Gustav Jung transformed psychology by revealing the hidden depths of the human mind. Born in 1875 in a small Swiss village, Jung grew up surrounded by mystery and supernatural experiences that shaped his lifelong fascination with the invisible forces governing human behavior. Initially trained as a psychiatrist, Jung worked closely with Sigmund Freud and became his chosen successor. However, Jung's revolutionary insights about the unconscious mind eventually led to a dramatic break with his mentor in 1913. While Freud viewed the unconscious primarily as a repository for repressed sexual desires and traumatic memories, Jung discovered something far more profound and complex. Jung recognized that the unconscious operates as a living, dynamic system that actively participates in shaping our conscious experience. He observed that patients often described dreams, fantasies, and symbols that had no connection to their personal histories yet appeared universally across different cultures and time periods. This observation led Jung to propose a revolutionary two-layer model of the unconscious mind. The first layer, which Jung termed the personal unconscious, contains all the material that has slipped out of consciousness during an individual's lifetime. This includes forgotten childhood memories, repressed emotions, unfinished thoughts, and experiences too painful or insignificant for conscious awareness. The personal unconscious acts like a vast library where everything we have ever experienced gets stored, even if we cannot consciously access these memories. These forgotten contents continue to influence our behavior through sudden emotional reactions, inexplicable preferences, and automatic responses to certain situations. The second layer represents Jung's most groundbreaking discovery, the collective unconscious. This deeper realm contains universal patterns of human experience that transcend individual biography and cultural conditioning. Jung realized that certain images, themes, and behavioral patterns appear consistently across all human societies, suggesting they emerge from our shared evolutionary heritage rather than personal learning. These universal elements, which Jung called archetypes, include fundamental human experiences like birth, death, the mother figure, the wise old man, and the hero's journey. The collective unconscious explains why people from completely different backgrounds often share similar dreams, create comparable myths, and respond to certain symbols in predictable ways. For example, the image of a great mother figure appears in virtually every culture, from the Christian Virgin Mary to Hindu goddesses to ancient Earth Mother deities. These archetypal patterns emerge spontaneously in dreams, art, literature, and religious experiences because they represent fundamental structures of human consciousness itself. Jung believed that understanding these universal patterns could help individuals connect with the deeper wisdom of humanity and find meaning in their personal struggles. Jung discovered that the unconscious communicates with consciousness through a sophisticated symbolic language. Dreams, fantasies, sudden insights, and even psychological symptoms serve as messages from the unconscious, attempting to restore balance and promote psychological growth. Unlike Freud, who saw dreams primarily as wish fulfillment, Jung viewed them as compensatory mechanisms that provide missing perspectives and guide the conscious mind toward greater wholeness. The unconscious possesses its own intelligence and often knows solutions to problems that baffle our rational thinking. Part 2. Psychic energy. Jung revolutionized psychology by treating the mind as an energy system governed by natural laws similar to those found in physics. He believed that psychological energy, which he called libido, flows throughout the psyche like electricity through a circuit. Unlike Freud, who viewed libido exclusively as sexual energy, Jung understood it as a general life force that manifests in all human activities, including creativity, spiritual pursuits, intellectual work, and emotional connections. This energy constantly moves between different psychological contents, creating the dynamic patterns we observe in human behavior. Jung discovered that psychic energy operates according to a fundamental principle he called compensation. When conscious attitudes become too one-sided or extreme, the unconscious automatically generates opposing tendencies to restore psychological balance. For example, if someone becomes overly rational and dismisses all emotional considerations, their unconscious will produce dreams, fantasies, or symptoms that force them to confront their neglected feeling side. This compensatory mechanism ensures that no single psychological function dominates completely, preventing dangerous psychological imbalances. The flow of psychic energy creates what Jung termed psychological complexes, which are clusters of emotionally charged ideas that operate somewhat independently within the psyche. These complexes can temporarily capture large amounts of psychological energy, causing sudden mood changes, obsessive thoughts, or compulsive behaviors. Jung observed that when energy becomes stuck in a complex, it often signals an important psychological issue that requires conscious attention and integration. Understanding energy flow helps explain why certain experiences trigger disproportionate emotional reactions, or why some people become fixated on particular ideas or relationships. Jung noticed that psychic energy naturally moves in cycles, alternating between periods of progression and regression. During progressive phases, energy flows toward conscious goals and external adaptation, helping individuals accomplish worldly tasks and develop their ego identity. During regressive phases, energy withdraws from external concerns and flows back toward unconscious contents, often bringing up childhood memories, primitive fantasies, or archetypal images. Rather than viewing regression as pathological, Jung recognized it as a necessary process that allows the psyche to reconnect with its deeper sources of wisdom and creativity. The concept of psychological energy also explains the phenomenon of psychological inflation, where individuals become identified with powerful archetypal contents and lose their sense of personal boundaries. When someone unconsciously identifies with an archetype like the wise sage or the heroic savior, they may experience grandiose feelings and believe they possess superhuman abilities. This inflation occurs because archetypal energy is collective rather than personal, and when it flows through an individual ego, it can create dangerous delusions of grandeur. Jung emphasized that recognizing and respecting the autonomous nature of archetypal energy helps prevent such psychological inflation and maintains healthy ego boundaries. Part 3. Psychological types. Jung's theory of psychological types emerged from his careful observation of fundamental differences in how people perceive and interact with the world. After years of clinical work and personal reflection, Jung identified two basic attitude types that determine whether individuals primarily focus their energy inward or outward. He called these fundamental orientations extraversion and introversion, terms that have since become part of everyday language but are often misunderstood in their original psychological meaning. Jung emphasized that these are not personality categories, but rather descriptions of how psychic energy naturally flows in different individuals. Extraversion involves directing psychological energy toward the external world of people, objects, and activities. Extroverted individuals tend to be energized by social interaction, seek stimulation from their environment, and naturally focus on external circumstances when making decisions. They typically think out loud, process experiences by discussing them with others, and feel comfortable acting quickly without extensive internal reflection. Extroverted types often appear confident and socially skilled, but they may struggle with prolonged solitude and tend to avoid deep introspection. Introversion involves focusing psychological energy inward, toward thoughts, feelings, and inner experiences. Introverted individuals tend to be energized by solitude, prefer to process experiences internally before sharing them, and naturally consider their inner reactions when making decisions. They typically think before speaking, need time alone to recharge after social interaction, and feel comfortable with extended periods of reflection and contemplation. Introverted types often appear thoughtful and self-contained, but they may struggle with spontaneous social interaction and tend to avoid large group situations. Jung discovered that these attitude types are largely innate and remain relatively stable throughout life, though individuals can develop their less preferred attitude through conscious effort. He observed that most people strongly favor one attitude, while the other remains less developed and largely unconscious. This creates an interesting dynamic, where the unconscious often compensates for conscious one-sidedness by producing dreams, fantasies or attractions that pull individuals toward their less developed attitude. Understanding these natural preferences helps explain many interpersonal conflicts and misunderstandings that arise when extroverted and introverted types attempt to communicate or work together. Jung also noticed that within each attitude type, individuals show marked preferences for how they gather information and make decisions. Some people naturally trust their direct sensory experience and focus on concrete facts and practical details, while others prefer to focus on possibilities, patterns, and abstract concepts. Similarly, some individuals make decisions primarily through logical analysis and objective criteria, while others prioritize personal values and the impact of decisions on human relationships. These different ways of processing information and making decisions create additional layers of psychological type differences that profoundly influence how people approach work, relationships, and life challenges. Part 4. The Four Functions. Jung identified 4 fundamental psychological functions that represent different ways the human mind processes information and makes decisions. These functions operate like specialized tools in the psyche, each providing a unique perspective on reality and contributing to our overall understanding of the world. Jung discovered that while everyone possesses all 4 functions, individuals typically develop 1 or 2 functions more fully, while the others remain relatively unconscious and undifferentiated. This uneven development creates both strengths and blind spots that significantly influence personality, career choices, and relationship dynamics. The thinking function processes information through logical analysis, objective reasoning, and systematic evaluation of cause and effect relationships. Individuals who strongly favor thinking tend to make decisions by analyzing facts, weighing pros and cons, and applying consistent principles regardless of personal feelings or social considerations. They excel at problem-solving, strategic planning, and understanding complex systems, but may struggle to consider the human impact of their decisions or appreciate the value of emotions in decision-making. Thinking types often appear detached and impersonal, but this objectivity allows them to maintain fairness and consistency even in emotionally charged situations. The feeling function evaluates information based on personal values, human considerations, and the subjective worth of different options. Individuals who favor feeling make decisions by considering what matters most to them personally and how their choices will affect other people. They excel at understanding human motivations, creating harmony in relationships, and recognizing the underlying values that guide behavior, but may struggle with impersonal analysis or making difficult decisions that hurt others. Feeling types often appear warm and empathetic, and their value-based approach helps them create meaningful connections and maintain group cohesion. The sensation function focuses on immediate sensory experience, concrete facts, and practical realities of the present moment. Individuals who favor sensation tend to trust what they can see, hear, touch, and directly experience, rather than abstract theories or future possibilities. They excel at noticing details, working with their hands, and dealing with practical problems that require attention to immediate circumstances, but may struggle with long-term planning or understanding theoretical concepts. Sensation types often appear grounded and realistic, and their practical focus helps them excel in fields requiring attention to concrete details and immediate results. The intuition function perceives patterns, possibilities, and hidden meanings that exist beyond immediate sensory experience. Individuals who favor intuition tend to focus on future potential, underlying connections, and innovative possibilities rather than present realities. They excel at seeing the big picture, generating creative solutions and understanding complex theoretical relationships, but may struggle with practical details or following through on routine tasks. Intuitive types often appear visionary and imaginative, and their ability to perceive hidden possibilities helps them excel in fields requiring innovation and strategic thinking. Jung discovered that these four functions operate in partnership, with thinking and feeling forming one pair of opposites, and sensation and intuition forming another pair. He also identified a crucial mechanism called the transcendent function, which helps integrate opposing psychological contents and create new conscious attitudes. The transcendent function emerges when conscious and unconscious elements unite to produce creative solutions that transcend the limitations of either perspective alone. Understanding and developing this integrative capacity becomes essential for psychological growth and the resolution of internal conflicts. Part 5. Complexes. Jung's discovery of psychological complexes represents one of his most important contributions to understanding mental functioning. Through his innovative word association experiments, Jung found that certain words triggered delayed responses, emotional reactions, and memory lapses that revealed the presence of autonomous psychological structures operating outside conscious control. These complexes function like independent personalities within the psyche, each possessing their own emotions, memories, and behavioral patterns that can temporarily take control of consciousness. Jung realized that everyone possesses multiple complexes, and understanding their nature becomes crucial for psychological health and personal development. A complex forms when a cluster of emotionally charged ideas, memories, and associations becomes organized around a central archetypal core. For example, a mother complex might include personal memories of one's actual mother, cultural images of motherhood, and the archetypal pattern of the great mother that exists in the collective unconscious. When activated, this complex can cause an individual to react to certain people or situations as if they were encountering their mother, regardless of the actual circumstances. The complex operates autonomously, meaning it has its own agenda and can override rational thinking when triggered by specific situations or relationships. Jung observed that complexes often develop during childhood, when powerful emotional experiences combine with archetypal patterns to create lasting psychological structures. A child who experiences neglect or abandonment might develop a complex organized around themes of rejection and unworthiness that continues to influence relationships throughout adult life. These early complexes become like psychological magnets that attract similar experiences and interpret ambiguous situations according to their established patterns. Understanding personal complexes helps explain why certain relationships or situations trigger disproportionate emotional reactions, or why people repeatedly find themselves in similar, problematic circumstances. Complexes reveal themselves through various psychological phenomena, including projection, where individuals unconsciously attribute their own complex contents to other people. Someone with an unresolved father complex might automatically view authority figures as either idealized saviors or threatening tyrants, depending on the specific nature of their complex. Complexes also manifest through psychological inflation, where individuals become identified with archetypal contents and lose their sense of personal boundaries and limitations. A person inflated with a savior complex might believe they have special powers to rescue others and become grandiose or messianic in their behavior. Working with complexes requires developing what Jung called conscious realization, the ability to recognize when a complex has been activated and distinguish between complex-driven reactions and appropriate responses to actual circumstances. Jung developed specific therapeutic techniques including active imagination and dream analysis to help individuals dialogue with their complexes and integrate their contents more consciously. Rather than trying to eliminate complexes, which Jung considered impossible and undesirable, the goal involves developing a healthy relationship with these autonomous psychological structures. When complexes are acknowledged and integrated, they can become sources of creativity, passion, and psychological energy, rather than disruptive forces that create suffering and interpersonal conflict. Part 6. The individuation process. Jung considered individuation the central task of human psychological development and the ultimate goal of his analytical psychology. This process involves the gradual realization and integration of the various components of the psyche into a unified whole, leading to the emergence of the true self. Unlike simple ego development, which focuses on adapting to external demands and social expectations, individuation requires confronting and integrating unconscious contents that may challenge or contradict conscious beliefs and attitudes. Jung viewed this as a natural process that unfolds throughout life, but one that requires conscious participation and courage to face difficult psychological truths. The individuation process typically begins in midlife, when individuals start questioning the values and goals that previously gave their lives meaning. Jung observed that many people experience a psychological crisis during their 30s or 40s when external achievements fail to provide lasting satisfaction and deeper questions about life's purpose begin to emerge. This crisis often manifests as depression, anxiety, relationship problems, or a general sense of emptiness despite outward success. Jung understood these symptoms as signals from the unconscious that the time has come to embark on a deeper journey towards psychological wholeness and authentic self-expression. The early stages of individuation involve withdrawing psychological projections and taking responsibility for disowned aspects of personality. Individuals must recognize and reclaim parts of themselves that they have unconsciously projected onto other people, institutions, or ideals. This includes confronting the shadow, those aspects of personality that contradict the conscious self-image and have been relegated to the unconscious. The process also requires integrating the contrasexual aspects of personality, what Jung called the anima in men and animus in women, which represent the undeveloped psychological functions and attitudes that complement conscious personality. As individuation progresses, individuals begin to experience a shift in their relationship to the ego and its goals. The ego, which previously functioned as the center of personality, gradually learns to serve the deeper self that emerges from the integration of conscious and unconscious contents. This transition often involves periods of uncertainty and disorientation as old identity structures dissolve and new ones have not yet fully formed. Jung compared this phase to the alchemical process of dissolution and renewal, where the old personality must die before a more authentic self can be born. The ultimate goal of individuation is not perfection but wholeness, which includes acceptance of human limitations, contradictions, and the inevitable presence of suffering in life. Individuated individuals develop what Jung called a religious attitude toward life, meaning they experience a sense of connection to something greater than their personal ego concerns. They become capable of holding paradox and tension without rushing to eliminate discomfort, and they develop a deep appreciation for the mystery and complexity of human existence. Jung emphasized that individuation is never complete, but represents an ongoing process of growth and self-discovery that continues throughout life. Part 7. The Self-Archetype. The self represents Jung's most profound discovery about the deepest structure of human personality and the ultimate goal of psychological development. Unlike the ego, which serves as the center of conscious awareness, the self encompasses the totality of both conscious and unconscious psychic contents, functioning as the organizing principle of the entire personality. Jung described the self as both the goal of individuation and the guiding force that orchestrates the psychological development process from behind the scenes. This archetype emerges gradually throughout life as individuals integrate various aspects of their personality and develop a more complete understanding of their true nature. The self-archetype manifests in consciousness through powerful symbols that convey a sense of wholeness, completion, and transcendence. These symbols include geometric forms like circles, squares, and mandalas, as well as images of divine figures, wise old men or women, and mythological beings that represent ultimate authority and wisdom. Jung noticed that individuals undergoing psychological transformation often spontaneously draw circular patterns or feel drawn to religious and spiritual imagery that depicts unity and transcendence. These self-symbols appear in dreams, active imagination, and artistic expressions as the psyche attempts to represent its deepest organizing principle in symbolic form. The relationship between ego and self undergoes a fundamental transformation during the individuation process. In the first half of life, the ego typically functions as if it were the center of personality, making decisions based on personal desires, social expectations, and rational calculations. However, as individuation progresses, the ego gradually learns to recognize and serve the deeper wisdom of the self, which possesses a broader perspective on life's meaning and purpose. This shift requires the ego to surrender its illusion of total control and develop what Jung called a religious attitude that acknowledges the presence of forces greater than conscious will. Jung observed that the self often communicates with consciousness through synchronistic experiences, meaningful coincidences that suggest an underlying order and intelligence operating beyond personal control. Individuals may notice that important life events seem to unfold according to a pattern that becomes apparent only in retrospect, as if guided by an invisible hand. The self also manifests through what Jung called the transcendent function, which creates new conscious attitudes by bridging opposing psychological contents and generating creative solutions to internal conflicts. These experiences provide evidence that something beyond the ego is organizing psychological development and guiding individuals toward their unique path of self-realization. The emergence of the self as a living reality and consciousness represents the culmination of the individuation process and the development of genuine psychological maturity. Individuals who have developed a conscious relationship with the self typically display a quality of centered presence and inner authority that does not depend on external validation or achievement. They become capable of making difficult decisions based on inner conviction rather than social pressure, and they develop the capacity to hold paradox and uncertainty without losing their psychological equilibrium. Jung emphasized that realizing the self does not eliminate human problems, but provides a stable foundation for navigating life's challenges with wisdom, compassion, and authentic self-expression. Part 8. The Shadow. The shadow represents one of Jung's most psychologically challenging and socially relevant discoveries about human nature. This archetype encompasses all the aspects of personality that individuals find unacceptable and therefore relegate to the unconscious, creating a hidden counterpart to the conscious persona. The shadow contains not only negative qualities like aggression, selfishness and crude impulses, but also positive potentials that contradict social expectations or threaten the conscious self-image. Jung emphasized that everyone possesses a shadow and that psychological health requires acknowledging and integrating these disowned aspects rather than pretending they do not exist. Shadow formation begins early in childhood, when social conditioning teaches individuals which aspects of their natural personality are acceptable and which must be hidden or suppressed. Parents, teachers and peer groups communicate explicit and implicit messages about appropriate behavior, causing children to develop a persona that conforms to social expectations while pushing unacceptable impulses into the unconscious. This process is necessary for social functioning, but creates an internal split that can become problematic if the shadow remains completely unconscious and unintegrated. Cultural and family values heavily influence which specific qualities end up in the shadow, explaining why shadow contents vary significantly between individuals and social groups. The shadow typically reveals itself through psychological projection, where individuals unconsciously attribute their own disowned qualities to other people. Someone who has repressed their aggressive impulses might become hypersensitive to aggression in others and react with disproportionate moral outrage to relatively minor displays of assertiveness. Shadow projection also explains many forms of prejudice and social conflict, as groups project their collective shadow onto other ethnicities, religions or political movements. Jung observed that the qualities we most strongly condemn in others often represent aspects of our own shadow that we refuse to acknowledge or integrate consciously. Dreams frequently provide the first glimpse of shadow contents through disturbing images of dark figures, criminals, animals, or same-sex characters who embody qualities the dreamer finds reprehensible. These shadow figures often pursue, attack, or threaten the dream ego, representing the unconscious pressure to acknowledge and integrate disowned aspects of personality. Jung encouraged individuals to dialogue with these dream figures rather than simply fighting or fleeing from them, as they contain valuable energy and capabilities that can enhance conscious personality when properly integrated. Active imagination techniques can help establish ongoing communication with shadow figures and gradually transform them from threatening adversaries into powerful allies. Integrating the shadow requires tremendous courage and honesty because it means acknowledging aspects of oneself that contradict cherished self-concepts and moral ideals. However, Jung discovered that shadow integration actually strengthens rather than corrupts conscious personality by providing access to previously unavailable energy, creativity, and authentic self-expression. Individuals who have integrated significant shadow contents become more spontaneous, passionate, and psychologically robust, while also developing genuine humility and compassion for human weakness. Jung warned that attempting to eliminate the shadow entirely leads to psychological inflation and dangerous unconscious possession, while conscious integration allows individuals to channel shadow energy constructively without being overwhelmed by it. Part 9. Anima and Animus. Jung discovered that every individual possesses an unconscious contrasexual aspect that compensates for the conscious gender identity and serves as a bridge between conscious and unconscious realms. In men, this unconscious feminine aspect is called the anima, while in women the unconscious masculine aspect is termed the animus. These archetypal figures represent much more than simple gender stereotypes. They embody the undeveloped psychological functions, emotional capacities, and spiritual possibilities that complement the conscious personality. Understanding and integrating the contrasexual archetype becomes essential for psychological completeness and the development of mature relationships with both oneself and others. The anima in men typically manifests as emotional, intuitive, and relational qualities that have been underdeveloped due to masculine socialization emphasizing logic, achievement, and emotional control. She often appears in dreams as a mysterious woman, seductress, or spiritual guide who leads the man toward greater emotional depth and connection with his inner life. When the anima remains unconscious, men may project her onto actual women, seeking in romantic relationships the emotional fulfillment and spiritual meaning they cannot provide for themselves. This projection creates unrealistic expectations and relationship difficulties, as no real woman can carry the full weight of a man's unlived psychological potential. The animus in women represents thinking, assertiveness, and spiritual authority that may have been suppressed by feminine socialization, emphasizing emotional receptivity and relational harmony. He often appears in dreams as a powerful man, teacher, or warrior who embodies conviction, intellectual strength, and the capacity for independent action. When the animus remains unconscious, women may become possessed by rigid opinions, aggressive argumentativeness, or an inability to think clearly about emotional situations. Alternatively, women may project the animus onto men, seeking in relationships the intellectual stimulation and spiritual authority they have not developed within themselves. Jung observed that contrasexual projection creates a psychological phenomenon he called participation mystique, where individuals become unconsciously merged with others and lose their sense of individual boundaries. When someone projects their anima or animus onto another person, they may experience intense attraction, idealization, or emotional dependency that has little to do with the actual qualities of the other person. These projections often lead to dramatic relationship conflicts when the idealized other fails to live up to unrealistic expectations, or when the projector begins to withdraw their projections and see the other person more realistically. Understanding projection dynamics helps explain why romantic relationships often begin with intense passion and gradually develop into more realistic but potentially disappointing connections. The integration of anima and animus requires developing a conscious relationship with these inner figures through dream work, active imagination, and the gradual withdrawal of projections from external relationships. As men develop their anima, they become more emotionally available, creative, and spiritually sensitive without losing their masculine strength and direction. As women integrate their animus, they develop intellectual confidence, assertive capabilities, and spiritual authority, while maintaining their feminine receptivity and relational wisdom. Jung emphasized that this integration does not eliminate gender differences but creates more complete individuals who can access both masculine and feminine psychological capacities as appropriate to different life situations. Part 10. The persona. The persona represents the mask or public face that individuals present to the world in order to function effectively in social and professional contexts. Jung derived this term from the masks worn by actors in ancient Greek theatre, emphasizing that the persona serves a legitimate dramatic function rather than being simply a form of deception or false advertising. Every individual develops multiple personas appropriate to different social roles such as parent, employee, friend or community member, and the ability to adapt one's presentation to various contexts represents an important social skill. However, problems arise when individuals become overly identified with their personas, or when the gap between public presentation and private reality becomes too extreme. Persona development begins in childhood, as individuals learn to modify their natural behavior to meet family and social expectations. Children quickly discover that certain aspects of their personality receive positive attention, while others provoke criticism or rejection, leading them to emphasize socially rewarded qualities and hide those deemed unacceptable. Educational and professional environments further shape persona development by rewarding specific skills, attitudes, and behavioral patterns while discouraging others. Over time, individuals may become so skilled at presenting their idealized self that they lose touch with their authentic feelings, desires, and spontaneous reactions. Jung observed that successful persona development requires finding an appropriate balance between social adaptation and authentic self-expression. A well-functioning persona allows individuals to meet legitimate social obligations and professional requirements without completely sacrificing their individuality and personal truth. However, when the persona becomes too rigid or elaborate, it can create a psychological prison that prevents genuine intimacy and self-knowledge. People may become exhausted from constantly maintaining their public image or feel increasingly disconnected from their true feelings and desires as they focus primarily on external validation and approval. The midlife crisis often involves a collapse or questioning of previously successful personas as individuals begin to realize that their public achievements have not provided the deep satisfaction they expected. Successful professionals may suddenly feel empty despite external recognition, or devoted parents may experience an identity crisis when their children become independent and no longer need constant care. These persona crises, while painful, often serve as invitations to explore more authentic ways of being and to develop aspects of personality that have been neglected in favor of social success. Jung viewed such crises as opportunities for psychological growth rather than simply problems to be solved or symptoms to be eliminated. Healthy persona development involves maintaining conscious awareness of the difference between one's social roles and one's core identity. Individuals need to be able to put on and take off their various personas as appropriate without becoming completely identified with any single role or social identity. This requires developing what Jung called ego strength, the capacity to maintain a sense of personal continuity and authenticity despite changing external demands and social expectations. When the persona serves the authentic self rather than replacing it, individuals can engage effectively with the social world, while remaining connected to their deeper sources of meaning and personal truth. Part 11. Parental Archetypes. The parental archetypes represent fundamental patterns of nurturing and authority that shape human development from birth through adulthood. Jung discovered that every individual carries within their unconscious both a great mother and great father image that transcends their personal experience with actual parents. These archetypal patterns influence how people understand caregiving, protection, discipline and guidance throughout their lives, affecting not only parent-child relationships but also connections with teachers, mentors, employers and religious figures. Understanding parental archetypes helps explain why certain authority figures trigger such powerful emotional reactions and why parenting challenges often activate deep unconscious conflicts. The Great Mother archetype encompasses both positive and negative aspects of the maternal principle. In her positive manifestation, she represents unconditional love, nurturing protection, fertile creativity, and the wisdom that comes from deep connection to natural cycles and instinctive knowledge. The positive mother provides emotional security, encourages growth and exploration, and offers comfort during times of difficulty and transition. However, the Great Mother also has a darker side that can become possessive, smothering, and destructive, representing the tendency to overprotect children and prevent their natural development toward independence and maturity. The Great Father archetype embodies both the protective and the disciplinary aspects of paternal authority. In his positive form, he represents strength, guidance, moral principles, and the capacity to provide structure and direction that helps children develop confidence and competence in the outer world. The positive father encourages achievement, teaches practical skills, and models how to engage effectively with social institutions and cultural expectations. The negative father archetype manifests as tyrannical control, harsh criticism, and rigid authoritarianism that crushes individual creativity and forces conformity through fear and punishment rather than love and understanding. Jung observed that individuals often develop what he called parental complexes when their personal parents fail to adequately embody the positive aspects of these archetypes, or when they become too identified with the negative manifestations. A mother complex might cause someone to remain psychologically dependent and unable to take responsibility for their own life, constantly seeking maternal figures to provide care and protection. A father complex might manifest as either rebellious opposition to all authority or submissive compliance that prevents the development of personal strength and independent judgment. These complexes continue to influence adult relationships, career choices, and life decisions until they are recognized and consciously addressed through psychological work. The integration of parental archetypes requires developing what Jung called the inner parent, the capacity to provide for oneself, the nurturing and guidance that may have been lacking in childhood. This involves learning to access the positive qualities of both maternal and paternal archetypes, regardless of one's biological gender, creating an internal source of support and wisdom that does not depend on external relationships. As individuals develop their inner parental capacity, they become able to offer authentic care and guidance to others without becoming possessive or controlling, and they can receive help and mentorship without losing their sense of personal autonomy. This psychological maturation allows people to break destructive family patterns and create healthier relationships with their own children and the younger people in their lives. Part 12. Hero's Journey and Child Archetype. The hero archetype represents one of humanity's most powerful and universal patterns for understanding personal transformation and the journey towards psychological maturity. Jung recognized that hero myths from cultures around the world share remarkably similar structures, suggesting they emerge from archetypal patterns embedded in the collective unconscious rather than mere cultural transmission. The hero's journey typically involves leaving the familiar world, facing dangerous challenges, receiving help from wise mentors, and returning home transformed with new knowledge or powers that benefit the community. This archetypal pattern provides a psychological map for the individuation process and helps individuals understand their own struggles for growth and self-realization. The psychological hero's journey begins with what Jung called the call to adventure, a disruption of ordinary life that forces individuals to confront new challenges and leave behind comfortable but limiting circumstances. This call might come through external events like job loss, relationship crisis, or illness, or through internal restlessness and dissatisfaction with existing life patterns. Initially, most people resist this call and attempt to maintain their familiar routines and identities, but the pressure for growth eventually becomes too strong to ignore. The decision to answer the call requires courage because it means abandoning known securities and entering unknown territory where old coping strategies may no longer work effectively. The child archetype represents the innocent, spontaneous, and creative aspects of human nature that often become buried under adult responsibilities and social conditioning. Jung identified several manifestations of the child archetype, including the divine child, who represents new potential and spiritual rebirth, and the wounded child, who carries the pain and limitations inherited from early life experiences. The child archetype possesses remarkable resilience and the capacity for wonder, play, and magical thinking that adults often lose in their pursuit of rational control and social success. Reconnecting with healthy child energy becomes essential for creativity, joy, and the maintenance of hope during difficult life transitions and challenges. The hero's journey involves a crucial relationship between the heroic ego and the child archetype, as the hero must learn to protect and nurture their inner child, while also developing the strength and skills necessary to face adult challenges. Many psychological problems arise when individuals either remain too identified with the child archetype and avoid adult responsibilities, or when they completely abandon their childlike qualities in favor of rigid adult personas. The successful completion of the hero's journey requires integrating both childlike wonder and adult competence, creating a mature personality that maintains access to creativity and spontaneity, while also possessing the strength to handle life's inevitable difficulties. This integration allows individuals to approach challenges with both wisdom and freshness, avoiding the cynicism that often accompanies purely adult perspectives. Jung emphasized that the hero's journey is not a one-time event, but a recurring pattern that individuals must navigate repeatedly throughout their lives. Each major life transition, from adolescence to marriage to parenthood to career changes to aging, involves leaving behind an old identity and developing new capacities for meeting changed circumstances. Understanding the archetypal nature of these transitions helps individuals recognize that their struggles are part of universal human experience rather than personal failures or unique problems. The hero's journey also provides hope during difficult periods by suggesting that current challenges serve a larger purpose in personal development, and that transformation and renewal remain possible regardless of past failures or present circumstances. Part 13. Trickster, Magician, and Cultural Archetypes. The trickster archetype represents one of the most ancient and psychologically significant figures in human consciousness, embodying the principle of creative chaos that disrupts established order and creates new possibilities. Found in virtually every culture, from the Norse god Loki to the Native American coyote to the African Anansi, the trickster challenges conventional wisdom and social rules through humor, cunning, and boundary-crossing behavior. Psychologically, the trickster represents the part of human nature that questions authority, exposes hypocrisy, and refuses to be contained by rigid social expectations or moral categories. This archetype serves an essential function in maintaining psychological flexibility and preventing individuals and societies from becoming too rigid or self-righteous. The magician archetype embodies the human capacity for transformation, knowledge of hidden laws, and the ability to bridge different levels of reality. The magician possesses special knowledge about how things work and can manipulate these forces to create desired changes in both inner and outer circumstances. In positive manifestation, the magician represents wisdom, healing power, and the capacity to help others transform their lives through insight and skill. However, the magician can also become corrupted into the manipulative sorcerer who uses knowledge for selfish purposes, or the inflated guru who claims powers that rightfully belong to the divine rather than the human ego. Cultural archetypes emerge from the collective experiences of specific societies and represent the shared values, fears, and aspirations that define group identity. American culture, for example, has developed distinctive archetypal patterns around figures like the self-made man, the rebel, and the pioneer, while other cultures emphasize different archetypal configurations based on their unique historical experiences and environmental challenges. These cultural archetypes powerfully influence individual psychology, shaping personal goals, relationship expectations, and beliefs about what constitutes a meaningful and successful life. Understanding cultural archetypes helps explain why people from different backgrounds often have difficulty understanding each other's motivations and values, even when they share similar personality types. Jung observed that cultural archetypes can become problematic when they are too rigidly defined, or when they exclude important aspects of human experience. Cultures that overemphasize masculine archetypes like the warrior or king may struggle to integrate feminine values like cooperation and emotional sensitivity, while cultures that idealize maternal figures may have difficulty accepting aggressive or competitive impulses. The process of cultural evolution involves the gradual transformation of archetypal patterns as societies encounter new challenges and develop new capacities for meeting them. Individual psychological development often requires questioning inherited cultural archetypes and developing a more personal and authentic relationship with universal archetypal energies. The integration of trickster and magician energies becomes particularly important for creative individuals and those working in fields that require innovation and transformation. The trickster provides the willingness to experiment, make mistakes, and challenge conventional approaches, while the magician offers the discipline and knowledge necessary to channel creative chaos into constructive outcomes. Both archetypes can become dangerous when they operate unconsciously, leading to destructive rebellion or manipulative power games rather than genuine transformation and growth. Conscious relationship with these archetypal energies allows individuals to serve as agents of positive change in their personal lives and communities, while avoiding the inflation and shadow possession that often accompanies identification with powerful archetypal figures. Part 14. Stages of Life. Jung revolutionized psychology by recognizing that human development continues throughout the entire lifespan, rather than ending with childhood or adolescence. He identified distinct psychological tasks and challenges that correspond to different life stages, each requiring specific developmental achievements and offering unique opportunities for growth and self-understanding. Unlike purely biological or social models of development, Jung's approach emphasized the psychological and spiritual dimensions of life transitions, recognizing that external changes often mask deeper internal transformations. Understanding these life stages helps individuals navigate major transitions with greater awareness and purpose, while recognizing that apparent crises often signal important developmental opportunities rather than simple problems to be solved. The first half of life, which Jung considered to extend roughly until age 40, focuses primarily on ego development and adaptation to external reality. During this period, individuals establish their identity, develop their capabilities, build relationships, and create their place in the social and professional world. The psychological tasks of this period include separating from parents, developing competence and confidence, establishing intimate relationships, and beginning to contribute to society through work and family responsibilities. Success during the first half of life typically involves developing a strong ego structure, mastering relevant skills, and achieving recognition and security in the external world. The midlife transition, which usually occurs between the late 30s and early 50s, represents a crucial turning point where the values and goals that previously provided meaning begin to feel insufficient or hollow. Jung observed that many individuals experience significant psychological disruption during this period as they question whether their achievements have truly satisfied their deeper longings for purpose and fulfillment. This transition often involves confronting mortality, recognizing unrealized potentials, and beginning to shift focus from external achievement to internal development and meaning-making. The midlife crisis, while often painful and disorienting, serves an essential function in redirecting psychological energy toward individuation and spiritual growth. The second half of life requires fundamentally different psychological orientations and developmental tasks compared to the first half. Rather than continuing to focus on ego expansion and external achievement, individuals must learn to serve something greater than their personal desires and ambitions. This period involves developing wisdom rather than just knowledge, finding meaning in limitation and loss, and preparing for the ultimate transition of death. Jung emphasized that the second half of life has a naturally religious character, meaning that individuals begin to seek connection with transcendent values and experiences that provide perspective on the temporary nature of earthly concerns. Each life stage transition involves what Jung called a sacrifice of the previous attitude, meaning that individuals must let go of identities, goals, and strategies that served them well in earlier periods, but have become obstacles to further development. Young adults must sacrifice childhood dependency and fantasy to develop adult competence and responsibility, while midlife individuals must sacrifice the illusion of unlimited possibility and eternal youth to embrace mature wisdom and acceptance. These sacrifices are rarely made willingly, which explains why life transitions often involve periods of resistance, depression, and apparent regression before new attitudes can emerge. Understanding the necessity of these psychological deaths and rebirths helps individuals approach life transitions with greater patience and trust in the natural development process rather than fighting against inevitable changes. Part 15. Midlife Crisis and Psychological Transformation. The midlife crisis represents one of Jung's most important discoveries about adult psychological development and the natural progression of human consciousness. Jung observed that sometime between the late 30s and early 50s, many individuals experience a profound questioning of the values, goals, and identities that previously gave their lives meaning and direction. This crisis often manifests as depression, anxiety, relationship problems, career dissatisfaction, or a general sense that life has lost its vitality and purpose despite external success and achievement. Rather than viewing these symptoms as pathological, Jung recognized them as signals from the unconscious that the time has come for a fundamental reorientation of psychological priorities and life direction. The midlife crisis typically emerges when individuals realize that the external achievements they pursued during the first half of life have not provided the deep satisfaction and meaning they expected. Successful professionals may suddenly feel empty. Despite recognition and financial security, devoted parents may experience identity confusion when their children become independent, and committed spouses may question whether their relationships truly reflect their authentic needs and desires. These realizations often trigger a period of intense self-examination and questioning that can feel like a complete breakdown of previously stable life structures. Jung understood this breakdown as a necessary prelude to psychological reconstruction based on more authentic and mature foundations. The psychological dynamics of midlife transformation involve a fundamental shift in the relationship between ego consciousness and the unconscious. During the first half of life, the ego typically dominates psychological functioning, making decisions based on personal ambition, social expectations, and rational planning for future goals. At midlife, the unconscious begins to assert its own agenda more forcefully, often through dreams, fantasies, symptoms, and attractions that contradict conscious plans and values. This creates an internal conflict between the established ego identity and emerging unconscious contents that demand recognition and integration into conscious personality. Jung identified several common themes that characterize midlife psychological transformation. Many individuals begin to question the persona they have developed for professional and social success, recognizing that their public image may have become disconnected from their authentic feelings and values. There is often a renewed interest in neglected aspects of personality, such as creative abilities that were abandoned for practical careers, or emotional sensitivities that were suppressed in favor of rational efficiency. The shadow aspects of personality may also emerge more forcefully as individuals become aware of impulses and desires they have long denied or projected onto others. The successful navigation of midlife transformation requires developing what Jung called a religious attitude, meaning a willingness to serve something greater than personal ego desires and ambitions. This does not necessarily involve traditional religious practice, but rather a recognition that life has deeper purposes and meanings that transcend individual achievement and gratification. Individuals must learn to listen to the wisdom of the unconscious while maintaining the ego strength necessary to function effectively in daily life. This integration process often takes several years, and may involve significant changes in relationships, career direction, and lifestyle as individuals align their external circumstances with their evolving inner truth and authentic self-expression. Part 16. Integration of Opposites. Jung's principle of the integration of opposites represents one of his most profound insights into the nature of psychological health and spiritual development. He observed that human personality naturally contains contradictory tendencies, conflicting desires, and opposing perspectives that create internal tension and apparent psychological problems. Rather than trying to eliminate these contradictions or choosing one side over another, Jung discovered that psychological growth requires learning to hold opposites in conscious tension until a new synthesis emerges that transcends the limitations of either extreme position. This process, which he called the transcendent function, creates new conscious attitudes and capabilities that would be impossible to achieve through rational analysis or willful decision-making alone. The most fundamental opposition in human psychology exists between conscious and unconscious contents of the psyche. Consciousness naturally tends toward order, control, and rational understanding, while the unconscious contains chaotic, instinctive, and irrational elements that often contradict conscious intentions and values. Many psychological problems arise when individuals try to maintain complete conscious control and refuse to acknowledge the legitimate needs and wisdom of unconscious contents. Integration requires developing the capacity to remain conscious while also remaining open to unconscious influences, creating a dynamic dialogue between rational and irrational aspects of personality, rather than allowing either to dominate completely. Other important psychological opposites include thinking versus feeling, sensation versus intuition, extroversion versus introversion, and masculine versus feminine psychological qualities. Most individuals develop a strong preference for one side of these opposites while relegating the other side to the unconscious, creating both strengths and blind spots in their personality development. Psychological maturity involves gradually developing the less preferred functions and attitudes without abandoning the naturally dominant ones, creating a more complete and flexible personality structure. This integration process often requires confronting the fear and resistance that arise when individuals attempt to develop psychological capabilities that feel foreign or threatening to their established self-image. Jung emphasized that integration does not mean eliminating psychological tensions or achieving a static state of perfect balance. Instead, it involves developing the capacity to remain centered while experiencing the full intensity of conflicting psychological forces without being torn apart by them. This creates what Jung called a creative tension that generates new insights, solutions, and possibilities for growth and self-expression. Individuals who have achieved significant integration of opposites often display a quality of psychological resilience and wisdom that allows them to navigate complex situations without becoming overwhelmed or rigid in their responses. The integration of opposites also has important implications for understanding relationships and social conflicts. Jung observed that many interpersonal problems arise when individuals project their own internal contradictions onto others, creating external conflicts that mirror unresolved internal tensions. When people learn to hold their own opposites consciously, they become less likely to engage in destructive projection and more capable of understanding and appreciating differences in others. This psychological development contributes to greater empathy, tolerance, and the capacity for genuine dialogue across differences of opinion, personality, and cultural background. Part 17. Dream Analysis. Jung's approach to dream analysis departed radically from Freudian methods and established dreams as one of the most important sources of psychological insight and guidance available to human consciousness. While Freud viewed dreams primarily as disguised wish fulfillments that revealed repressed sexual desires, Jung discovered that dreams serve a compensatory function, providing perspectives and information that balance and complement conscious attitudes. Jung treated dreams as direct communications from the unconscious that speak in their own symbolic language rather than as coded messages that need to be translated into rational concepts. This approach requires learning to understand dream symbolism on its own terms, rather than reducing dream images to predetermined meanings or theoretical interpretations. Jung developed a method called amplification that explores dream symbols by connecting them to cultural, mythological, and archetypal parallels, rather than focusing solely on personal associations. When a dream contains an image of a snake, for example, Jung would consider not only the dreamer's personal experiences with snakes, but also the universal symbolic meanings of serpents in mythology, religion, and folklore. This approach recognizes that dream symbols often carry both personal and collective meanings, connecting individual psychological development to larger patterns of human experience and wisdom. Amplification helps reveal the deeper archetypal dimensions of dreams while maintaining connection to their personal relevance for the individual dreamer. The compensatory function of dreams means they often present perspectives that contradict or balance the dreamer's conscious attitudes and beliefs. Someone who is overly rational and dismissive of emotions might dream of being overwhelmed by floods or storms, while someone who avoids responsibility might dream of being in positions of authority or leadership. Dreams frequently feature the shadow archetype through images of criminals, dark figures, or same-sex characters who embody qualities the dreamer has disowned or rejected. Rather than viewing these challenging dream contents as problems to be solved, Jung encouraged dreamers to consider what these images might be trying to teach them about neglected aspects of their personality. Jung observed that dreams often occur in series that develop themes and images over time, creating ongoing conversations between conscious and unconscious aspects of personality. Keeping a dream journal and tracking recurring symbols, characters, and situations helps reveal these larger patterns and their connection to the dreamer's psychological development and life circumstances. Some dreams appear to be compensatory reactions to immediate life situations, while others seem to anticipate future developments or provide guidance for important decisions and life transitions. The most significant dreams often contain powerful archetypal imagery that connects personal psychological development to universal human experiences and spiritual themes. Jung emphasized that dream interpretation requires active participation from the dreamer rather than passive acceptance of expert analysis. The dreamer must engage with dream images through active imagination, creative expression, and honest self-reflection to discover their personal meaning and significance. Dreams often resist quick intellectual understanding and require time, patience, and multiple approaches before they yield their insights and guidance. The goal of dream work is not to achieve final interpretations, but to establish an ongoing relationship with the unconscious that enriches conscious understanding and supports psychological growth and individuation throughout life. Part 18. Active Imagination. Active imagination represents Jung's most innovative therapeutic technique and his major contribution to practical methods for exploring and integrating unconscious contents. This process involves deliberately engaging with unconscious material through imagination while maintaining enough conscious awareness to observe and interact with what emerges. Unlike passive fantasy or daydreaming, active imagination requires focused attention and genuine dialogue with autonomous psychological contents that appear to have their own intentions and perspectives. Jung developed this technique through his own personal psychological crisis following his break with Freud, when he used active imagination to explore the disturbing unconscious material that later became his famous Red Book. The practice of active imagination begins by entering a relaxed but alert state of consciousness and allowing images, figures or scenarios to emerge spontaneously from the unconscious. Rather than directing or controlling these contents, the practitioner observes what appears and then engages with it as if encountering real autonomous beings or situations. This might involve having conversations with dream figures, exploring imaginary landscapes, or allowing dramatic scenarios to unfold while maintaining conscious participation and ethical responsibility for one's actions within the imagination. The key is to treat imaginary contents as psychologically real and meaningful rather than dismissing them as mere fantasy or wishful thinking. Jung discovered that active imagination provides direct access to archetypal material and allows individuals to work with psychological complexes in a safe but powerful way. Troubling shadow figures from dreams can be encountered and dialogued with in active imagination, often revealing their positive intentions and transforming from threatening adversaries into helpful allies. Anima and animus figures can be met and questioned about their needs and wisdom, helping to integrate contrasexual psychological contents more consciously. Active imagination also provides a method for exploring personal complexes and understanding their origins, needs, and potential for transformation without being overwhelmed by their emotional intensity. The practice requires careful attention to ethical considerations and psychological boundaries to prevent inflation or possession by autonomous unconscious contents. Jung emphasized that practitioners must maintain their ego integrity and moral responsibility, even while engaging with powerful archetypal energies and primitive psychological material. This means refusing to act out destructive impulses that emerge in imagination and maintaining clear distinctions between imaginary and external reality. Active imagination should enhance rather than replace engagement with the outer world, providing insights and energy that improve real-life relationships and responsibilities rather than creating escape from them. Jung found that active imagination often produces surprisingly creative and therapeutic results that cannot be achieved through purely rational approaches to psychological problems. Complex psychological conflicts may resolve spontaneously when allowed to play out in imagination, and creative solutions to practical problems often emerge from dialogue with unconscious figures. The technique also provides a way to continue psychological development throughout life by maintaining ongoing communication with the deeper layers of personality that contain wisdom and guidance beyond conscious understanding. Many individuals find that regular practice of active imagination enhances their creativity, emotional resilience, and capacity for self-understanding, while providing a reliable method for accessing inner guidance during difficult life transitions and important decisions. Part 19. Word association and other therapeutic techniques. Jung's word association experiments revolutionized the understanding of unconscious psychological processes and provided the first scientific evidence for the existence of autonomous psychological complexes. In these experiments, Jung would read a list of words to patients and measure their response, time and emotional reactions to each word, noting delays, unusual responses, and signs of emotional disturbance. Certain words consistently triggered delayed responses, memory lapses, and physiological changes that revealed the presence of emotionally charged psychological material operating outside conscious control. These experiments demonstrated that the unconscious contains organized psychological structures that can interfere with conscious functioning, and provided objective evidence for psychoanalytic theories about repressed psychological content. Jung developed several other innovative therapeutic techniques that focused on understanding the symbolic and creative expressions of the unconscious rather than relying solely on verbal analysis and interpretation. He encouraged patients to express their psychological experiences through art, movement, sand play, and other creative modalities that bypass rational defenses and allow unconscious contents to emerge more directly. Jung observed that many psychological insights cannot be adequately expressed in words alone and require symbolic or artistic expression to capture their full meaning and emotional significance. These creative approaches often reveal psychological dynamics and solutions that remain hidden when therapy focuses exclusively on verbal discussion and rational understanding. The technique of amplification became a cornerstone of Jungian therapy, involving the exploration of personal psychological material through connections to cultural, mythological, and archetypal parallels. When a patient reports a significant dream, symptom, or life experience, the therapist helps amplify its meaning by drawing on knowledge of similar patterns in mythology, folklore, and religious traditions from around the world. This approach helps patients understand their personal struggles as part of larger human experiences rather than isolated individual problems, often providing hope and perspective during difficult psychological passages. Amplification also reveals the archetypal dimensions of personal experience and helps connect individual psychological development to collective human wisdom and meaning. Jung pioneered the use of psychological typology as a therapeutic tool for understanding personality differences and reducing interpersonal conflicts. By helping patients understand their natural psychological preferences and the blind spots created by undeveloped functions, therapy can focus on developing greater psychological balance and flexibility. Understanding type differences also helps improve communication in relationships by recognizing that people naturally process information and make decisions in fundamentally different ways that are not necessarily wrong or pathological. This approach shifts the focus from trying to change personality to developing greater self-acceptance and more effective strategies for using natural psychological gifts while compensating for inherent limitations. Perhaps Jung's most important therapeutic insight involved recognizing the healing potential of the therapeutic relationship itself, which he understood as a mutual transformation process affecting both patient and therapist. Jung emphasized that therapists must remain open to being changed by their encounters with patients and must be willing to engage authentically rather than hiding behind professional personas or theoretical systems. This approach requires therapists to maintain ongoing attention to their own psychological development and to recognize their own complexes and projections that may interfere with therapeutic effectiveness. Jung viewed therapy as a collaborative exploration of psychological truth rather than an expert treatment of pathological conditions, emphasizing the importance of genuine human connection in facilitating psychological healing and growth. Part 20. Synchronicity. Synchronicity represents Jung's most controversial and mysterious discovery about the nature of meaningful coincidence and the hidden connections that link psychological and physical events. Jung defined synchronicity as the meaningful coincidence of inner psychological states with outer events that cannot be explained through normal cause and effect relationships. These experiences often occur during times of psychological transition or crisis, when individuals are grappling with important life decisions or undergoing significant internal transformation. Jung believed that synchronistic events suggest the existence of an underlying order and intelligence in the universe that connects mind and matter in ways that transcend our ordinary understanding of how reality operates. Jung's interest in synchronicity began with his observation that patients often reported meaningful coincidences during therapy that seemed to reflect or illuminate their psychological development. A patient struggling with trust issues might repeatedly encounter strangers who share intimate personal stories, or someone working on accepting their shadow might notice an unusual number of references to dark or criminal themes in their environment. These coincidences often carry symbolic meaning that relates directly to the individual's psychological situation, as if the external world were responding to and reflecting internal psychological processes. Jung initially dismissed these experiences as mere chance, but gradually recognized them as a distinct psychological and perhaps physical phenomenon worthy of serious investigation. The concept of synchronicity, challenges the Western scientific worldview that assumes all events must be connected through mechanical cause and effect relationships. Jung proposed that synchronistic events reflect what he called a causal connecting principle that links events through meaning rather than physical causation. This principle operates similarly to the archetypal patterns in the collective unconscious, creating meaningful connections that transcend the boundaries between inner psychological experience and outer physical reality. Jung suggested that consciousness and matter might be two aspects of a more fundamental reality that occasionally reveals itself through synchronistic experiences that unite subjective and objective dimensions of existence. Jung observed that synchronistic experiences often cluster around times when individuals are most open to unconscious contents and archetypal influences. People undergoing psychological analysis, creative artists working on important projects, and individuals facing major life transitions frequently report increased synchronistic occurrences that seem to provide guidance, confirmation, or warning about their current life direction. These experiences can feel like communications from a deeper intelligence that knows more about an individual's life path than their conscious ego can understand. Jung emphasized that synchronicity cannot be deliberately produced or controlled, but emerges spontaneously when conditions are right for meaningful connections between inner and outer experience. The practical significance of synchronicity lies not in its potential for prediction or control, but in its capacity to provide meaning and guidance during times of uncertainty and transition. When individuals learn to recognize and respect synchronistic experiences, they often develop a greater sense of connection to larger patterns of meaning and purpose that transcend their personal concerns and struggles. This can provide comfort during difficult periods and support for trusting the unfolding process of life, even when rational analysis cannot provide clear answers or direction. Jung viewed attention to synchronicity as one aspect of developing what he called a religious attitude toward life that recognizes the presence of mystery and meaning beyond rational understanding and personal control. Part 21. Alchemy and Psychology. Jung's extensive study of medieval alchemy provided him with a symbolic language for understanding psychological transformation and the individuation process that could not be adequately expressed through conventional psychological concepts. After years of struggling to communicate his insights about psychological development, Jung discovered that the alchemical texts contained detailed descriptions of the same transformation processes he observed in his patients and in his own psychological development. The alchemist's quest to transform base metals into gold served as a metaphor for the psychological transformation of unconscious contents into conscious awareness and the development of the integrated personality Jung called the self. This discovery provided Jung with a historical and symbolic framework that validated his psychological theories and offered practical guidance for understanding the stages and challenges of psychological development. Alchemical symbolism describes psychological transformation as a series of operations that involve the dissolution, purification, and reconstitution of psychological contents. The initial stage, called the nigredo, or blackening, corresponds to the confrontation with shadow material and the breakdown of existing psychological structures that have become inadequate or restrictive. This phase often involves depression, confusion, and the disintegration of previously stable identity structures, but Jung recognized it as a necessary prelude to psychological renewal. The albedo or whitening stage represents the emergence of new clarity and the integration of purified psychological contents, while the rubedo or reddening symbolizes the final achievement of psychological wholeness and the realization of the self. Jung found that alchemical texts provided detailed guidance for working with the psychological conflicts and paradoxes that characterize the individuation process. The alchemical principle of the union of opposites, symbolized by the marriage of the king and queen or the hermaphrodite, corresponds to the psychological integration of masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, spiritual and material aspects of personality. The alchemical emphasis on patient observation and gradual transformation offered an alternative to quick psychological fixes and supported Jung's belief that genuine psychological development requires time, attention, and respect for natural psychological processes. The mysterious nature of alchemical operations also validated Jung's observation that psychological transformation often involves elements that cannot be fully understood or controlled through rational analysis alone. The study of alchemy helped Jung understand that psychological development has always been a central human concern, even when disguised in seemingly non-psychological language and imagery. The alchemist's laboratory work served as an external focus for inner psychological processes, allowing them to project and work with unconscious contents through their chemical experiments and symbolic interpretations. Jung recognized that many religious, mystical, and esoteric traditions contain similar symbolic descriptions of psychological transformation processes, suggesting that the individuation journey represents a universal human experience rather than a modern psychological theory. This historical perspective provided Jung with confidence that his psychological insights reflected fundamental truths about human nature rather than merely personal or cultural peculiarities. Jung's alchemical studies also revealed the importance of what he called the participation mystique between the observer and the observed in psychological transformation work. The alchemists believed that their own psychological state influenced the success of their operations, recognizing that transformation requires the active participation of the entire personality rather than detached intellectual analysis. This insight supported Jung's emphasis on the therapeutic relationship as a mutual transformation process, and his belief that psychological understanding requires personal engagement rather than objective scientific observation. The alchemical tradition offered Jung a model for psychological work that honors both the scientific desire for understanding and the mystical recognition that some aspects of transformation transcend rational comprehension and control. Part 22. Religious Experience, Spirituality and the Psyche. Jung's relationship with religion and spirituality represented one of the most complex and controversial aspects of his psychological theories and personal development. Raised in a family of pastors but deeply troubled by conventional Christian doctrine from an early age, Jung spent his entire career attempting to understand religious experience from a psychological perspective without reducing it to mere pathology or wishful thinking. He distinguished between religion as organized institutional practice and religiosity as a fundamental psychological attitude that seeks connection with transcendent meaning and value. Jung believed that religious experience represents a natural and necessary aspect of psychological development, rather than a primitive or neurotic response to life's difficulties and uncertainties. Jung observed that many of his patients suffered from what he called a spiritual problem, meaning their psychological difficulties stemmed from a lack of meaning and connection to values greater than personal ego concerns. He noticed that individuals who experienced genuine religious or spiritual transformation often showed remarkable psychological healing and development that could not be explained through conventional therapeutic methods alone. These observations led Jung to conclude that the human psyche naturally seeks relationship with what he termed the numinous, those experiences of the sacred that evoke awe, reverence, and a sense of connection to ultimate reality. Jung argued that suppressing or dismissing these spiritual needs creates psychological imbalance and contributes to many forms of mental and emotional suffering. The concept of the self-archetype provided Jung with a psychological framework for understanding religious experience without reducing it to mere projection or delusion. Jung observed that the symbols and experiences associated with self-realization often possess the same qualities that characterize religious experience, including feelings of unity, transcendence, and connection to absolute value and meaning. He suggested that authentic religious experience involves an encounter with the self-archetype, which represents the divine image within human personality rather than a projection onto external deities or institutions. This perspective allows for the validation of religious experience while maintaining a psychological rather than metaphysical understanding of its nature and significance. Jung's approach to spirituality emphasized direct personal experience rather than adherence to established doctrines or institutional authorities. He encouraged individuals to develop their own relationship with the sacred through attention to dreams, synchronicities, and the symbolic communications of the unconscious, rather than relying solely on traditional religious teachings or practices. Jung believed that genuine spiritual development requires the same kind of psychological honesty and self-confrontation involved in any authentic individuation process, including the integration of shadow material and the recognition of personal limitations and contradictions. This approach often conflicts with conventional religious expectations that emphasize moral purity and idealistic self-improvement rather than the acceptance of human complexity and ambiguity. Jung's emphasis on the psychological reality of religious experience had profound implications for understanding both mental health and spiritual development. He argued that psychological problems often reflect spiritual crises, and that effective therapy must address the meaning-making and value-seeking aspects of human nature, rather than focusing solely on symptom reduction or behavioral change. Similarly, Jung warned that spiritual practices that ignore psychological reality often lead to inflation, projection, and other forms of unconscious possession, rather than genuine transcendence and wisdom. His integration of psychological and spiritual perspectives offered a path toward wholeness that honors both the scientific understanding of human nature and the legitimate human need for connection with transcendent meaning and purpose. Part 23. Mythology, Fairy Tales and Collective Symbols. Jung's study of mythology and fairy tales provided crucial evidence for his theory of the collective unconscious and revealed the universal psychological patterns that underlie human experience across all cultures and historical periods. He discovered that the same basic stories, symbols, and character types appear repeatedly in the folklore of societies that have had no historical contact with each other, suggesting these patterns emerge from shared psychological structures rather than cultural transmission. These archetypal stories serve as maps for understanding fundamental human experiences like growing up, falling in love, facing challenges, and discovering personal identity and purpose. Jung viewed mythology and fairy tales as the collective dreams of humanity that preserve and transmit essential psychological wisdom from generation to generation. Fairy tales particularly fascinated Jung because they present archetypal patterns in their simplest and most direct form, stripped of the elaborate cultural and historical details that characterize more complex mythological systems. The basic structure of fairy tales typically involves a young person leaving home, facing various trials and challenges, receiving help from magical figures, and ultimately achieving transformation and integration. This pattern mirrors the individuation process and provides guidance for understanding the psychological tasks and obstacles involved in personal development and self-realization. Jung observed that the symbolic language of fairy tales speaks directly to the unconscious and often provides insights about psychological problems that cannot be accessed through rational analysis alone. The study of collective symbols revealed how archetypal images carry multiple layers of meaning that can be understood at personal, cultural, and universal levels simultaneously. The symbol of the tree, for example, might represent personal growth for an individual, cultural values about connection to nature for a society, and the archetypal pattern of the axis mundi that connects earth and heaven for humanity as a whole. Jung discovered that authentic symbols cannot be artificially created or manipulated, but emerge spontaneously from the unconscious when conditions are right for their appearance. These natural symbols possess what Jung called a transcendent function that bridges conscious and unconscious contents and facilitates psychological transformation and growth. Jung found that modern individuals often suffer from symbol poverty, meaning they have lost connection to the rich symbolic traditions that previously provided meaning and guidance for psychological development. The rationalistic and materialistic orientation of contemporary culture tends to dismiss symbolic thinking as primitive or superstitious, leaving people without adequate resources for understanding their inner experiences and life transitions. This symbolic impoverishment contributes to feelings of meaninglessness and disconnection that characterize many modern psychological problems and spiritual crises. Jung encouraged individuals to reconnect with mythological and fairy tale wisdom while also remaining open to the emergence of new symbols that might be more appropriate for contemporary psychological needs and challenges. The practical application of mythological and fairy tale wisdom involves learning to recognize archetypal patterns in personal experience and using these patterns as guides for understanding current psychological situations and future development possibilities. Someone struggling with a difficult relationship might find guidance in stories about the integration of beauty and beast, while a person facing career challenges might benefit from hero journey narratives about overcoming obstacles and discovering hidden abilities. Jung emphasized that these stories should not be interpreted literally, but understood as symbolic maps that provide perspective and encouragement for navigating the universal human experiences of growth, challenge, and transformation. This approach helps individuals recognize that their personal struggles are part of larger patterns of human experience, and that wisdom for addressing these challenges has been preserved in the collective stories and symbols of humanity. Part 24. Art, Creativity and Mandala Symbolism. Jung's exploration of art and creativity revealed their crucial role in psychological development and the expression of unconscious contents that cannot be adequately communicated through rational language alone. He observed that creative expression often emerges from the same psychological depths that produce dreams and symptoms, but transforms potentially disturbing unconscious material into forms that can be consciously appreciated and integrated. Jung distinguished between two types of creative work: psychological art that focuses on personal experience and meaning, and visionary art that channels archetypal contents from the collective unconscious and speaks to universal human experiences. Both forms serve important psychological functions, but visionary art particularly fascinated Jung because of its capacity to reveal collective psychological dynamics and anticipate cultural developments. The mandala symbol became central to Jung's understanding of psychological wholeness and the self-archetype. Jung first encountered mandalas in his own psychological work when he began spontaneously drawing circular patterns during his personal crisis following his break with Freud. He discovered that creating these circular designs provided a sense of psychological centering and helped integrate conflicting psychological contents into a unified whole. Jung later found that mandala symbols appear universally in religious art, cultural traditions, and the spontaneous artistic expressions of individuals undergoing psychological transformation, suggesting they represent an archetypal pattern for organizing psychological experience around a stable center. Jung observed that mandalas naturally emerge in the artwork of individuals who are working to integrate opposing psychological forces and achieve greater personality wholeness. The circular boundary of the mandala provides a contained space where conflicting elements can be arranged in harmonious relationship without destroying each other through unresolved tension. The center of the mandala often contains symbols that represent the self or divine presence, while the surrounding areas display various psychological contents in balanced relationship to this organizing principle. Creating mandalas can serve as both a diagnostic tool for understanding current psychological states and a therapeutic technique for promoting integration and psychological healing. The process of artistic creation itself serves important psychological functions that extend beyond the production of aesthetic objects or personal entertainment. Jung discovered that genuine creative work requires the ego to step aside and allow unconscious contents to emerge and find expression through the creative medium. This process of creative surrender and conscious collaboration with unconscious forces provides practice for the kind of ego-self-relationship that characterizes psychological maturity and wisdom. Creative work also provides a safe way to explore and express psychological contents that might be too threatening or overwhelming to encounter directly through other means, allowing gradual integration of shadow material and archetypal energies. Jung emphasized that the psychological value of artistic expression does not depend on technical skill or aesthetic sophistication, but on the authenticity and depth of the psychological contents being expressed. Simple drawings, poems, or other creative expressions that emerge spontaneously from psychological need often possess more therapeutic value than technically accomplished works that remain disconnected from genuine inner experience. Jung encouraged individuals to engage in regular creative practice as part of their psychological development, viewing artistic expression as a natural human capacity that provides access to wisdom and healing resources that exist beyond rational understanding. This approach treats creativity not as a special talent possessed by a few gifted individuals, but as a fundamental psychological function that can support growth and integration throughout life for anyone willing to engage authentically with their inner creative impulses. Part 25. Neurosis, Psychosis and Mental Health. Jung's approach to understanding mental illness departed significantly from traditional medical models by viewing psychological symptoms as meaningful expressions of unconscious conflicts, rather than simply biological dysfunctions to be eliminated. He observed that neurotic symptoms often serve a compensatory function, attempting to restore psychological balance when conscious attitudes have become too one-sided, or when important psychological needs have been ignored or suppressed. Rather than viewing symptoms as purely pathological, Jung recognized them as communications from the unconscious that signal the need for psychological adjustment and growth. This perspective shifts the focus from symptom elimination to understanding the psychological meaning and purpose behind disturbing mental and emotional experiences. Jung distinguished between neurosis and psychosis based on the individual's relationship to unconscious contents and their capacity to maintain ego functioning. In neurosis, the ego remains relatively intact, but conflicts with unconscious contents create anxiety, depression, obsessions, or other symptoms that interfere with daily functioning. The neurotic individual typically maintains awareness of reality, but experiences internal conflicts between conscious intentions and unconscious impulses, or between different psychological complexes. Jung viewed neurosis as a sign that the personality has become unbalanced and needs to integrate neglected or rejected aspects of psychological experience in order to achieve greater wholeness and authentic self-expression. Psychosis, in Jung's understanding, involves a more serious breakdown in the relationship between ego, consciousness, and unconscious contents, often resulting in the flooding of consciousness by archetypal material that cannot be adequately integrated or understood. Rather than viewing psychotic experiences as meaningless brain disorders, Jung looked for the psychological significance and symbolic meaning contained within apparently bizarre thoughts, perceptions, and behaviors. He observed that psychotic episodes often contain profound spiritual and archetypal themes that reflect the individual's attempt to resolve fundamental questions about identity, meaning, and relationship to ultimate reality. This approach suggests that some forms of mental breakdown might represent incomplete or misdirected attempts at psychological breakthrough and transformation. Jung's concept of mental health emphasized psychological wholeness and the capacity for ongoing growth and adaptation, rather than the mere absence of symptoms or perfect social adjustment. He believed that psychological health requires maintaining a dynamic relationship between conscious and unconscious contents that allows for the integration of new experiences and the continued development of personality throughout life. This includes the ability to access and express the full range of human psychological capacities, including thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, and the various archetypal energies that provide vitality and meaning. Jung warned that excessive psychological one-sidedness, even in socially approved directions, creates the conditions for eventual psychological breakdown and symptom formation. The therapeutic implications of Jung's approach emphasize supporting the individual's natural healing processes rather than imposing external solutions or attempting to eliminate all psychological discomfort. Jung believed that psychological symptoms often contain the seeds of their own resolution, and that the goal of therapy should be to help individuals understand and work with their symptoms rather than simply fighting against them. This approach requires patience and trust in the wisdom of psychological processes that may initially appear destructive or meaningless, but often reveal their constructive purpose when approached with respect and careful attention. Jung's perspective offers hope for individuals struggling with mental health challenges by suggesting that psychological difficulties often represent attempts at growth and self-healing that can be supported and facilitated through understanding and appropriate psychological work. Part 26. Projection, Transference and Relationship Dynamics. Jung's understanding of projection revealed one of the most fundamental mechanisms by which unconscious contents influence conscious experience and interpersonal relationships. Projection occurs when individuals unconsciously attribute their own psychological qualities, conflicts, or potentials to other people, seeing in others what they cannot recognize or accept within themselves. This process operates automatically and largely outside conscious awareness, creating distorted perceptions of other people that reflect the projector's internal psychological state rather than the actual characteristics of the person being perceived. Jung observed that projection serves both defensive and developmental functions, protecting the ego from threatening self-knowledge while also providing opportunities for psychological growth through the eventual recognition and withdrawal of projections. The mechanism of projection operates most powerfully when individuals encounter others who carry some genuine resemblance to the projected content, creating what Jung called a hook for the projection to attach itself. Someone who has repressed their aggressive impulses might become intensely reactive to relatively minor displays of assertiveness in others, while someone who has disowned their creative potential might feel either envious or dismissive toward artistic individuals. These projections often feel completely justified and rational to the person making them, making it extremely difficult to recognize when projection is occurring rather than accurate perception. The emotional intensity surrounding certain relationships and reactions often provides the best clue that projection may be involved, as the strength of feeling usually exceeds what the actual situation warrants. Transference represents a specific form of projection that occurs within therapeutic relationships and other situations involving authority, intimacy, or dependency. Jung observed that patients inevitably project archetypal images onto their therapists, seeing them as parental figures, wise guides, or even divine healers who possess special powers to provide salvation or transformation. These transference projections often recreate early relationship patterns and unresolved conflicts from childhood, providing opportunities to work through psychological wounds and develop more mature relationship capacities. Jung emphasized that transference is a natural and necessary part of psychological healing that should be understood and worked with rather than avoided or quickly dissolved through interpretation alone. Countertransference, Jung's term for the therapist's emotional reactions to patients, represents an equally important but often overlooked aspect of relationship dynamics in therapy and other intimate connections. Jung recognized that therapists inevitably have their own psychological reactions to patients that can provide valuable information about unconscious dynamics operating within the therapeutic relationship. Rather than viewing countertransference as a problem to be eliminated, Jung saw it as a source of insight that could enhance therapeutic understanding when approached with conscious awareness and appropriate boundaries. This perspective revolutionized therapeutic practice by acknowledging that healing relationships involve mutual psychological influence rather than one-way expert treatment of passive recipients. The recognition and withdrawal of projections represents one of the most important tasks of psychological development and healthy relationship functioning. This process requires developing the capacity to distinguish between one's own psychological contents and the actual characteristics of other people. Taking responsibility for disowned aspects of personality rather than trying to change or control others. Jung observed that successful projection withdrawal often involves a period of disillusionment, as idealized or demonized others are seen more realistically, followed by the challenging work of integrating previously projected contents into conscious personality. This process ultimately leads to more authentic relationships based on genuine appreciation for others as they actually are, rather than as carriers of unconscious psychological projections, while also promoting psychological growth through the integration of previously unconscious personality aspects. Part 27. Eastern Philosophy Influences. Jung's encounter with Eastern philosophical and spiritual traditions profoundly influenced his understanding of consciousness, psychological development, and the ultimate goals of human existence. Beginning in the 1920s, Jung studied Hindu, Buddhist, Taoist, and other Eastern texts, finding remarkable parallels between Eastern descriptions of consciousness transformation and his own observations about individuation and psychological wholeness. Unlike many Western intellectuals who approached Eastern philosophy as exotic curiosities, Jung recognized these traditions as sophisticated psychological systems that offered practical guidance for understanding and working with the deeper layers of human consciousness. This cross-cultural perspective validated Jung's psychological theories while also expanding his understanding of human potential and the possibilities for consciousness development. The Hindu concept of the self as the ultimate reality underlying individual consciousness provided Jung with a framework for understanding his own discovery of the self-archetype. Jung found striking similarities between his clinical observations about self-realization and the Hindu descriptions of discovering one's true nature beyond the ego identity. Both traditions emphasize that genuine psychological maturity requires recognizing the illusory nature of the separate ego and developing identification with a deeper, more universal aspect of consciousness. However, Jung maintained that his psychological approach differed from traditional Hindu philosophy by focusing on the integration of unconscious contents rather than transcending or escaping from psychological experience entirely. Buddhist teachings about the nature of suffering, attachment, and the possibility of liberation resonated deeply with Jung's understanding of neurosis and psychological healing. The Buddhist analysis of how mental suffering arises from clinging to fixed ideas about self and reality paralleled Jung's observations about how psychological rigidity creates internal conflicts and symptoms. The Buddhist emphasis on mindful awareness and non-judgmental observation of mental processes influenced Jung's therapeutic techniques and his approach to working with unconscious contents. Jung particularly appreciated the Buddhist middle way philosophy that avoids extreme positions and seeks balance between opposing forces, seeing it as compatible with his own emphasis on integrating psychological opposites rather than eliminating them. Taoist philosophy provided Jung with valuable insights about the natural flow of psychological energy and the importance of wu wei, or effortless action that aligns with natural processes rather than forcing outcomes through willful control. The Taoist concept of yin and yang as complementary opposites that create dynamic balance influenced Jung's understanding of how psychological transformation occurs through the integration of opposing forces rather than the victory of one side over another. Jung found the Taoist emphasis on following natural rhythms and cycles particularly relevant for understanding psychological development and the timing of therapeutic interventions. The Taoist ideal of the sage who has achieved harmony with the natural order provided Jung with a model for psychological maturity that emphasized wisdom and spontaneous responsiveness rather than rigid control or perfectionist achievement. Despite his deep appreciation for Eastern wisdom traditions, Jung maintained that Western individuals needed to find their own authentic path to psychological wholeness rather than simply adopting Eastern practices without understanding their cultural context. He warned against what he called psychic inflation that could result from premature identification with Eastern spiritual ideals without adequate psychological preparation and integration. Jung emphasized that genuine psychological transformation requires honest confrontation with one's own cultural conditioning and personal shadow rather than escape into exotic spiritual practices that might provide temporary relief but fail to address fundamental psychological conflicts. His integration of Eastern and Western perspectives created a unique approach to psychological development that honored both scientific understanding and contemplative wisdom while remaining grounded in practical therapeutic work and personal psychological experience. Part 28, Cultural Psychology, Social Dynamics and Collective Behavior. Jung's insights into individual psychology naturally extended to understanding group dynamics, cultural phenomena, and the psychological forces that shape collective human behavior. He observed that the same archetypal patterns that influence individual development also operate at cultural and social levels, creating shared myths, values, and behavioral patterns that define group identity and guide collective action. Jung recognized that cultures, like individuals, possess both conscious values and collective shadows, and that understanding these group psychological dynamics becomes essential for comprehending social conflicts, political movements, and cultural changes. His analysis of collective psychology provided a framework for understanding how individual psychological health interconnects with the psychological health of the broader social and cultural environment. The concept of collective shadow helps explain many forms of social prejudice, scapegoating, and intergroup conflict that characterize human societies throughout history. Just as individuals project their personal shadow onto others, groups unconsciously project their collective shadow onto other ethnicities, religions, political movements, or nations that become carriers of disowned collective qualities. This projection process allows groups to maintain idealized self-images while attributing all negative qualities to external enemies or inferior others. Jung observed that these collective projections often intensify during times of social stress or uncertainty, when groups seek simple explanations for complex problems and clear targets for their fears and frustrations. Jung's analysis of mass movements and political phenomena revealed how archetypal energies can be activated and manipulated at the collective level. He observed that successful political leaders often embody or activate powerful archetypal images such as the wise father, the savior hero, or the strong protector that resonate with unconscious collective needs and fantasies. When entire populations become possessed by archetypal energies without conscious understanding, they may engage in destructive collective behaviors that individual members would never consider in their personal lives. Jung's analysis of the rise of Nazism in Germany provided a chilling example of how collective psychological regression can occur when rational consciousness is overwhelmed by primitive archetypal forces that promise simple solutions to complex social and economic problems. The phenomenon of participation mystique operates powerfully in group settings, creating unconscious psychological merging that can either enhance collective creativity and cooperation or lead to dangerous loss of individual judgment and moral responsibility. Jung observed that individuals often lose their capacity for independent thinking when they become too identified with group consciousness, allowing collective emotions and opinions to override personal values and rational analysis. This psychological fusion can create the intense solidarity and shared purpose that characterizes effective teams and communities. But it can also facilitate mob behavior and collective violence when group consciousness becomes dominated by shadow projections and archetypal possession. Understanding participation mystique helps explain both the positive potential and the dangerous risks inherent in all forms of collective human endeavor. Jung emphasized that healthy cultural development requires the same kind of consciousness and integration that characterizes individual psychological maturity. Cultures need to recognize and integrate their collective shadows rather than projecting them onto other groups, and they must develop the capacity to hold paradox and complexity rather than seeking oversimplified solutions to social problems. This requires individuals who have achieved sufficient psychological development to resist collective possession and maintain independent judgment, while still contributing constructively to group goals and social cooperation. Jung viewed the development of conscious individuals as essential for cultural progress, since only people who have integrated their own shadows and developed authentic selfhood can help groups navigate the psychological challenges inherent in collective human life without succumbing to destructive archetypal possession or shadow projection. Part 29. The Red Book and Liber Novus. Jung's personal psychological crisis and his creation of the Red Book between 1913 and 1930 represents one of the most extraordinary examples of self-analysis and inner exploration in psychological history. Following his dramatic break with Freud, Jung entered a period of intense psychological turmoil that he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. Rather than seeking external help or retreating from his psychological distress, Jung decided to deliberately enter into dialogue with his unconscious contents through a process he would later formalize as active imagination. This dangerous but necessary journey into his own psychological depths provided the experiential foundation for virtually all of his subsequent theoretical contributions to psychology and the understanding of human consciousness. The Red Book, which Jung originally titled Liber Novus or New Book, chronicles Jung's encounters with various autonomous figures from his unconscious, including Philemon, Salome, Elijah, and other mysterious personalities who seem to possess independent existence and wisdom. Jung engaged in extended conversations with these inner figures, asking them questions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and human purpose, while carefully recording their responses and insights. These dialogues often challenged Jung's rational beliefs, and forced him to confront aspects of human experience that could not be understood through scientific materialism alone. The inner figures served as teachers and guides who helped Jung navigate the treacherous terrain of the unconscious while maintaining enough ego stability to survive the process and integrate his discoveries. Jung's method involved entering a state of relaxed concentration and allowing images and scenarios to emerge spontaneously from his unconscious, then engaging with these contents as if they were real, autonomous beings with their own intentions and perspectives. He would often begin by asking direct questions of his inner figures and waiting for responses that frequently surprised him with their wisdom and insight. Jung discovered that these inner personalities possessed knowledge and perspectives that his conscious mind could not have generated through ordinary thinking, suggesting they represented genuine autonomous psychological functions rather than mere fantasy or imagination. The process required tremendous courage, because Jung never knew what disturbing or challenging material might emerge from his unconscious explorations. The Red Book contains not only Jung's written dialogues with unconscious figures, but also his artistic representations of the visions and experiences he encountered during this period. Jung created elaborate, illuminated manuscripts with intricate drawings, paintings, and calligraphy that attempted to capture the visual and symbolic dimensions of his inner experiences. These artistic expressions serve both as records of his psychological journey and as active imagination techniques that helped him engage more deeply with the symbolic contents of his unconscious. The combination of written dialogue and artistic expression created a complete documentation of Jung's individuation process that later provided him with source material for developing his theories about archetypes, psychological types, and the structure of the unconscious. Jung kept the Red Book secret for most of his life. sharing its contents only with a few close associates and never publishing it during his lifetime. He feared that revealing the full extent of his psychological explorations might damage his scientific credibility and prevent others from taking his psychological theories seriously. The Red Book was finally published in 2009, nearly 50 years after Jung's death, allowing the world to see the experiential foundation underlying his analytical psychology. This remarkable document demonstrates that Jung's psychological insights emerged not from purely intellectual speculation, but from direct encounter with the deepest layers of human consciousness, providing compelling evidence for the reality of the unconscious and the possibility of conscious dialogue with autonomous psychological contents. Part 30. UFOs as Psychological Phenomena. Jung's analysis of the UFO phenomenon in his book Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Skies, represents one of his most fascinating explorations of how archetypal contents manifest in contemporary culture during times of collective crisis and transformation. Rather than focusing on whether UFOs represent actual extraterrestrial visitors, Jung approached the phenomenon as a psychologist interested in understanding why so many people were reporting similar visionary experiences of round, luminous objects in the sky. He observed that UFO sightings increased dramatically during periods of social tension and uncertainty, suggesting they might represent projections of unconscious psychological contents onto external phenomena. Jung's analysis revealed that UFO experiences often carry the same symbolic meaning as religious visions and archetypal dreams, indicating they emerge from the same psychological depths that produce spiritual and transformative experiences. The circular shape of most reported UFOs immediately caught Jung's attention because of its connection to mandala symbolism and the self-archetype. Jung had observed that individuals undergoing psychological transformation often spontaneously draw circular patterns or feel drawn to round symbols that represent psychological wholeness and integration. He theorized that UFO sightings might represent collective projections of the self-archetype onto external objects during a time when humanity desperately needs symbols of unity and transcendence. The luminous quality of UFOs also connects them to traditional religious symbolism of divine light and spiritual illumination, suggesting they carry numinous meaning that speaks to deep human needs for connection with transcendent reality. Jung observed that UFO experiences often occur to individuals who are undergoing personal psychological crises or transformation, similar to the conditions that produce religious visions and mystical experiences. The witnesses frequently report feelings of awe, fear, and spiritual significance that resemble encounters with the divine or archetypal realm. Jung noted that UFO abduction accounts often follow patterns similar to shamanic initiation experiences or mystical journeys involving encounters with otherworldly beings who provide special knowledge or transformation. These parallels suggested to Jung that UFO experiences might represent modern forms of visionary experience that serve the same psychological functions as ancient religious and mythological encounters with gods, angels, or other supernatural beings. The technological appearance of UFOs reflects the contemporary cultural context in which these archetypal projections are occurring. Jung recognized that archetypal contents always manifest through symbols and images that are meaningful within their particular historical and cultural setting. In an age dominated by scientific materialism and technological advancement, the human need for transcendent experience naturally expresses itself through technological rather than traditional religious imagery. UFOs represent a compromise between the rational scientific worldview that dominates modern consciousness and the deep human need for mystery, meaning and connection with forces greater than individual human existence. Jung's UFO analysis demonstrates his broader insight that psychological projections often intensify during periods of collective crisis when existing cultural symbols and institutions fail to provide adequate meaning and guidance. The post-World War II era brought unprecedented technological power, nuclear weapons, and rapid social change that created deep anxiety about humanity's future survival and direction. UFO sightings provided a way for the collective unconscious to express both fears about technological destruction and hopes for salvation through superior wisdom and guidance from beyond human limitations. Jung viewed the UFO phenomenon as a symptom of humanity's need for new symbols and stories that could help navigate the psychological challenges of technological civilization while maintaining connection to deeper sources of meaning and transcendence that purely rational approaches cannot provide. Part 31. The Senex and Pure Archetypes. The Senex and Pure represent one of the most psychologically significant archetypal oppositions that Jung identified, embodying the eternal tension between youth and age, innovation and tradition, spontaneity and structure, that characterizes both individual development and cultural dynamics. The puer aeternus, or eternal youth archetype, represents the part of human nature that remains forever young, creative, and full of potential, but often struggles with commitment, discipline, and the practical demands of adult responsibility. The Senex, or wise old man archetype, embodies wisdom, experience, structure, and the capacity for long-term thinking and planning, but can become rigid, pessimistic, and resistant to change and innovation. Understanding the dynamic relationship between these archetypal energies becomes crucial for navigating life transitions, creative work, and the balance between freedom and responsibility that challenges every individual and society. The pure archetype manifests in individuals who maintain a youthful enthusiasm for life, demonstrate exceptional creativity and vision, and possess an almost magical ability to inspire others with their dreams and possibilities. Pure-dominated personalities often display remarkable talent, charisma, and the capacity to see beyond conventional limitations and imagine new ways of living and creating. However, the shadow side of the pure includes difficulty with commitment, tendency to abandon projects when they become routine or demanding, and resistance to the practical work required to manifest creative visions in concrete reality. Pure individuals may struggle with addiction, relationship instability, and chronic dissatisfaction as they search for perfect experiences that match their idealistic visions, but consistently disappoint them when reality fails to live up to fantasy. The Senex archetype provides the complementary energy of wisdom, discipline, and the capacity to build lasting structures and institutions that preserve valuable cultural achievements across generations. Senex-dominated individuals excel at strategic thinking, long-term planning, and the patient work required to develop expertise and create meaningful contributions to society. They often serve as mentors, teachers, and guardians of tradition, who help younger generations learn from past mistakes and build upon previous accomplishments. However, the shadow side of the Senex includes excessive rigidity, pessimism about change and innovation, and tendency to crush youthful enthusiasm and creativity through harsh criticism and impossibly high standards. Jung observed that healthy psychological development requires integrating both puer and Senex energies rather than identifying completely with either archetypal position. The integrated individual maintains the puer's creativity, enthusiasm, and openness to new possibilities, while also developing the Senex's wisdom, discipline, and capacity for sustained effort and commitment. This integration becomes particularly important during midlife, when individuals must find ways to honor both their youthful dreams and their accumulated wisdom and experience. The creative tension between pure and senex energies can generate innovative solutions that combine visionary thinking with practical wisdom, avoiding both the pure's tendency toward impractical fantasy and the senex's resistance to necessary change and growth. The pure senex dynamic also operates at cultural and generational levels, creating ongoing tensions between innovation and tradition that drive cultural evolution and change. Societies need both the pure energy that challenges existing structures and envisions new possibilities, and the senex energy that preserves valuable traditions and provides stable foundations for cultural development. Generational conflicts often reflect the archetypal tension between pure and senex, as younger generations seek to overthrow established ways, while older generations attempt to preserve hard-won wisdom and achievements. Understanding this archetypal dimension of social conflict can help reduce personal animosity and promote more constructive dialogue between different generational perspectives, recognizing that both innovation and tradition serve essential functions in healthy cultural development. Part 32. Psychoid Archetype and Mind-Matter Unity. Jung's concept of the psychoid archetype represents one of his most sophisticated and prescient insights into the fundamental relationship between consciousness and physical reality. In his later years, Jung began to speculate that archetypes might exist not only as psychological patterns within human consciousness, but as organizing principles that operate in both mental and physical domains. This revolutionary idea suggested that the archetypal patterns Jung observed in dreams, myths, and psychological development might reflect deeper structural principles that govern the organization of matter and energy throughout the universe. The psychoid archetype concept anticipated many contemporary discussions about consciousness, quantum physics, and the possibility that mind and matter represent different aspects of a more fundamental underlying reality. Jung's interest in the relationship between psyche and matter was stimulated by his collaboration with physicist Wolfgang Pauli on the nature of synchronicity and meaningful coincidence. Through their extensive correspondence and joint research, Jung and Pauli explored the possibility that psychological and physical events might be connected through underlying patterns that transcend the conventional distinction between subjective and objective reality. They observed that quantum mechanical phenomena seemed to involve consciousness in ways that challenged materialistic assumptions about the independence of mind and matter. Jung began to wonder whether the archetypal patterns he observed in psychological experience might represent the same organizing principles that create pattern and order in the physical universe. The psychoid hypothesis suggests that archetypes exist in a realm that is neither purely psychological nor purely physical, but rather psychophysically neutral, manifesting as psychological patterns when encountered by consciousness and as physical patterns when expressed through matter and energy. This would explain why archetypal symbols and patterns appear not only in human psychology, but also in the structure of crystals, the behavior of biological systems, and the mathematical relationships that govern physical phenomena. Jung speculated that what we call consciousness and what we call matter might be two different ways of experiencing or describing the same underlying archetypal reality. This perspective offers a potential bridge between scientific materialism and psychological or spiritual understanding, by suggesting they describe different aspects of a unified reality rather than completely separate domains. Jung's psychoid concept has profound implications for understanding synchronicity and the meaningful coincidences that often accompany psychological transformation. If archetypal patterns operate in both psychological and physical domains, then synchronistic experiences might represent moments when the underlying unity of mind and matter becomes temporarily visible to consciousness. This would explain why synchronicities often involve external events that mirror or symbolically represent internal psychological states, as if the same archetypal pattern were expressing itself simultaneously through consciousness and through physical circumstances. The psychoid archetype concept suggests that these experiences reflect genuine connections between mind and matter rather than mere projection or wishful thinking. Contemporary research in quantum physics, consciousness studies and systems theory has developed ideas remarkably similar to Jung's psychoid archetype concept, suggesting he was ahead of his time in recognizing the inadequacy of strict mind-matter dualism. Fields such as quantum field theory, morphic resonance and information theory explore how pattern and organization might represent fundamental aspects of reality that transcend conventional physical and psychological categories. Jung's psychoid archetype concept provides a psychological framework for understanding these developments and their implications for human consciousness and spiritual experience. This perspective offers hope for eventually developing a more integrated understanding of reality that honors both scientific knowledge and psychological wisdom, while recognizing their common foundation in the deeper patterns that organize all existence. Part 33. The Symbolic Life. Jung's philosophy of the symbolic life represents his mature understanding of how human consciousness can remain connected to deeper sources of meaning and wisdom in an increasingly rationalistic and materialistic world. He observed that modern civilization had largely lost touch with symbolic thinking and the capacity to recognize meaningful patterns that connect individual experience to larger cosmic and spiritual realities. Jung believed that living symbolically involves maintaining awareness of the deeper significance and meaning that underlies everyday experiences, seeing ordinary events as expressions of archetypal patterns and universal human themes. This symbolic attitude allows individuals to remain connected to the transcendent dimensions of existence while still functioning effectively in practical and rational contexts. Jung distinguished between signs and symbols in ways that illuminate the difference between superficial and profound approaches to meaning-making. Signs point to known realities and communicate specific information in direct and literal ways, while symbols point toward unknown or unknowable realities that can only be approached through metaphor, paradox, and intuitive understanding. Living symbolically means developing the capacity to recognize when experiences carry symbolic significance that transcends their literal meaning and opens doorways to deeper understanding. This requires cultivating what Jung called symbolic attitude, a way of perceiving that remains open to multiple layers of meaning and significance rather than reducing everything to rational categories and practical functions. The symbolic life involves paying attention to dreams, synchronicities, and other manifestations of the unconscious that provide guidance and perspective beyond what rational analysis can offer. Jung encouraged individuals to develop personal rituals, creative practices, and contemplative activities that help them stay connected to the symbolic dimensions of their experience. This might include keeping a dream journal, engaging in artistic expression, spending time in nature, or participating in religious or spiritual practices that honor mystery and transcendence. The goal is not to abandon rational thinking, but to supplement it with symbolic awareness that provides access to wisdom and guidance from deeper psychological and spiritual sources. Jung observed that individuals who lose connection to symbolic life often experience what he called spiritual poverty. a sense of meaninglessness and disconnection that no amount of external success or rational understanding can remedy. Without access to symbolic meaning, life becomes reduced to mechanical routines and purely practical concerns that fail to nourish the deeper human needs for purpose, transcendence, and connection to something greater than personal ego concerns. The symbolic life provides an antidote to this modern malaise by helping individuals recognize the sacred dimensions present within ordinary experience and maintain connection to the eternal patterns that give life meaning and direction. This approach does not require belief in particular religious doctrines, but rather cultivates an attitude of reverence and wonder toward the mystery and complexity of existence itself. Living symbolically also involves recognizing how personal experiences participate in larger archetypal patterns that connect individual development to universal human themes and cosmic processes. A person struggling with a difficult relationship might recognize their situation as a manifestation of the eternal tension between freedom and commitment, while someone facing career challenges might see their struggle as part of the hero's journey toward discovering authentic vocation and purpose. This symbolic perspective provides comfort and guidance during difficult periods by revealing that personal struggles are part of larger meaningful patterns rather than random suffering or individual failure. The symbolic life ultimately offers a way of living that honors both rational intelligence and intuitive wisdom, while maintaining openness to the mystery and wonder that make human existence meaningful and worthwhile despite its inevitable difficulties and limitations. Part 34. Psychological types in relationships and teams. Jung's typology system provides invaluable insights for understanding relationship dynamics, team effectiveness, and the sources of both conflict and complementarity that arise when different personality types interact. Each psychological type brings unique strengths and perspectives to relationships, but these same differences can create misunderstandings and conflicts when individuals fail to appreciate the validity of approaches that differ from their own natural preferences. Understanding type dynamics helps explain why certain relationship patterns repeat across different partnerships and why some teams function smoothly while others struggle with persistent communication problems and interpersonal tension. This knowledge can transform potentially destructive differences into opportunities for mutual learning and enhanced effectiveness through conscious appreciation of complementary psychological gifts. In romantic relationships, psychological type differences often create both the initial attraction and the ongoing challenges that couples must navigate throughout their partnership. Opposite types frequently attract each other because each partner offers psychological qualities that the other lacks or has underdeveloped, creating opportunities for growth and completeness through relationship. An introverted thinking type might be drawn to an extroverted feeling type who helps them access emotional warmth and social connection, while the feeling type benefits from the thinking type's logical analysis and objective perspective. However, these same differences can become sources of frustration when partners expect each other to change fundamental aspects of their personality, or when they interpret type differences as personal rejection or inadequacy. Successful relationships between different types require developing what Jung called psychological generosity, the capacity to appreciate and support your partner's natural way of functioning, even when it differs significantly from your own preferences. This involves learning to communicate in ways that respect type differences rather than trying to force partners to adopt unfamiliar psychological approaches that feel foreign or uncomfortable. For example, introverted partners need time alone to process experiences and make decisions, while extroverted partners need verbal processing and social interaction to think clearly and feel emotionally connected. Couples who understand these differences can create relationship structures that honor both partners' psychological needs rather than forcing compromise that leaves both people partially unsatisfied. Team effectiveness often depends on achieving appropriate psychological diversity that ensures all necessary functions and perspectives are represented in group decision-making and problem-solving processes. Effective teams typically include both thinking types who can analyze problems objectively and feeling types who consider human impact and values, as well as both sensing types who attend to practical details and intuitive types who generate innovative possibilities. Teams dominated by similar types often excel in certain areas while developing significant blind spots that can lead to poor decisions and missed opportunities. Understanding type dynamics helps team leaders assign roles appropriately, structure communication processes to include all perspectives, and resolve conflicts that arise from type-based misunderstandings rather than genuine disagreements about goals or values. The practical application of type awareness requires moving beyond simple categorization to develop genuine appreciation for the gifts and contributions that each type offers to collective endeavors, rather than using type knowledge to excuse limitations or avoid personal growth. Individuals can use typological understanding to identify areas where they need support from others and opportunities to develop their less preferred functions. This creates more conscious and effective relationships where differences become resources for mutual enhancement rather than sources of conflict and misunderstanding. Teams and couples who successfully integrate type awareness often report improved communication, reduced conflict, and enhanced creativity as they learn to leverage their psychological diversity rather than fighting against it or trying to eliminate natural differences that actually strengthen their collective capacity and effectiveness. Part 35. Legacy, Modern Applications and Integration. Jung's profound influence on psychology, psychotherapy, and human understanding extends far beyond his original theoretical formulations and continues to evolve through contemporary applications and research. His foundational insights about the unconscious, psychological types, archetypes, and individuation have been integrated into numerous therapeutic approaches, educational systems, and organizational development programs around the world. Modern Jungian analysis continues to develop his original methods while incorporating new understanding about trauma, neuroscience, and cultural diversity, demonstrating the ongoing relevance and adaptability of his core insights about human psychological development. Jung's emphasis on meaning, spirituality, and wholeness has provided alternatives to purely medical or behavioral approaches to psychological healing that address the full complexity of human experience. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator and other personality assessment tools have popularized Jung's psychological types theory and made it accessible to millions of people in business, education, and personal development contexts. While these applications sometimes oversimplify Jung's complex understanding of psychological types, they have helped individuals and organizations appreciate personality differences and improve communication across different cognitive styles and preferences. Contemporary type theory has expanded Jung's original formulations to include cultural variations, developmental aspects, and more nuanced understanding of how types manifest in different life contexts and professional environments. This widespread application of typological thinking has contributed to greater acceptance of psychological diversity and reduced tendency to pathologize natural differences in how people process information and make decisions. Jung's insights about trauma, psychological complexes, and the compensatory functions of symptoms have influenced modern trauma therapy, family systems work, and other contemporary therapeutic approaches. His understanding that symptoms often contain important psychological information and serve adaptive functions has supported the development of more collaborative and respectful therapeutic relationships that honor client wisdom and natural healing processes. Contemporary therapists integrate Jungian concepts like active imagination, dream work, and creative expression into various treatment modalities, recognizing their value for accessing and processing psychological material that resists purely verbal or cognitive approaches. The Jungian emphasis on the therapeutic relationship as a mutual transformation process has influenced many forms of relational and humanistic therapy that prioritize authentic human connection over technical intervention. Modern applications of Jungian psychology extend into organizational development, leadership training, and social change work that addresses collective psychological dynamics and cultural transformation. Understanding archetypal patterns, shadow projection, and collective complexes helps leaders and change agents work more effectively with group dynamics and cultural resistance to necessary changes and innovations. Environmental psychology, conflict resolution, and social justice work increasingly incorporate Jungian insights about how unconscious psychological forces influence collective behavior and how conscious integration can promote more constructive social change. The growing interest in mindfulness, spirituality, and holistic approaches to human development reflects Jung's prescient recognition that purely rational and materialistic worldviews cannot adequately address fundamental human needs for meaning and transcendence. Perhaps Jung's most important legacy lies in his demonstration that psychology can embrace both scientific rigor and respect for the mystery and complexity of human existence without abandoning either perspective. His integration of empirical observation with mythological wisdom, therapeutic practice with spiritual insight, and individual development with collective understanding created a comprehensive approach to human psychology that remains relevant for contemporary challenges. As humanity faces unprecedented global challenges that require both technological innovation and psychological wisdom, Jung's emphasis on consciousness development, shadow integration, and the cultivation of meaning provides essential guidance for navigating complexity without losing connection to deeper sources of wisdom and value. His vision of individuation as both personal fulfillment and service to collective human development offers hope that individual psychological growth can contribute to the larger project of creating more conscious and compassionate human societies.